This weekend, we're really continuing to explore the question of how policy decisions should be made and how they should be scrutinised in a good UK democracy. So as many of you will remember, I hope that last time we met, we spoke really about where that balance of power should lie between government and parliament within what would be a good system of representative democracy. This time, and there was a lot of learning. There was a lot of quite technical information about how that relationship between government and parliament actually works at the moment and where different powers lie. This time, we're really going to be focusing in on the role of the public, both the role of the public plays at elections in terms of actually choosing the government, but also once a government and parliament has been elected, and what ongoing role the public might be able to have in terms of being involved in decision making. So not only choosing their representatives, but actually monitoring the activity once a government or a parliament is elected, holding them to account, and potentially influencing decisions throughout the life of that government and that parliament. So our agenda for today is going to follow quite a similar pattern to last time. This morning, we're going to be hearing from what we've been calling the kind of informant speakers. So very much talking about the roles that the public do and could play. And then in the afternoon, we're going to be spending a bit of time exploring the sort of strengths and limitations of a range of different mechanisms for involvement. And that's going to be kicked off with a sort of panel discussion hosted by Alan, and then some time in your groups to really explore some of the different methods that we're going to be introducing to you. So before we go any further, I'm going to hand over to Alan now just to do a bit of a sort of introduction and context setting for the weekend. So over to you, Alan.
Great, thank you, Kayla. So yeah, quick introduction from me for the weekend as a whole. I'm just trying to share my screen, but there we go. Yes, introduction to the weekend from me. So as you know, and as Kayla's just reminded us, we had those 2 weekends at the start where we kind of introduced ourselves to the system, started thinking about things a bit. Then we're in the middle of 3 weekends at the moment looking at particular parts of our democratic system. So we had that quite tough weekend last time looking at the roles of government and parliament. This time, we're going to be focusing in on the roles of the public in our democracy. Just before I say a bit more about that, a word about weekend 5. So many of you might have noticed that there's been quite a lot in the media since we last met about various MPs who've been found to have been breaking the rules on what MPs can do, or at least been accused of breaking the rules or abusing the rules. These are some of the things that we'll be exploring at the next weekend, at weekend 5. So some of you might well want to think about that and talk about that, and you will get the chance next weekend. So this time we're focusing in on the roles of the public, and our big question is how should members of the public be involved in decision making? So just to start off our thinking on that and to remind ourselves about some of what we've covered in previous weekends. So as we've said before, at the democratic system, the very heart of the democratic system is the people. Democracy means rule by the people, ultimately. But there are loads and loads of decisions that are being made every single day. It wouldn't remotely be possible for all of us to be involved in making every one of those decisions. So we need to have representatives who do a lot of the kind of day-to-day work of making those decisions. So that means that we, the people, elect our representatives in Parliament, and from Parliament then is formed the government, as we explored last time. So there's that system of representation, so that we are represented at the heart of power. And then there's also a kind of a relationship going in the opposite direction, a relationship of accountability as well. So the ministers in the government are accountable to Parliament. They have to answer to Parliament for what they do. And the MPs in Parliament ultimately are accountable to us as well. And if we don't like what they're doing, then we can vote them out at election time. So we have those relationships of accountability going in the opposite direction. And there are many parts of the democratic system that are designed to help ensure that those those kind of core activities of representation and accountability work hopefully effectively. So obviously there are elections through which we choose our representatives in Parliament. And I should have said, when I'm referring to Parliament there, I could mean the UK Parliament, but also there's of course the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Parliament, and the Northern Ireland Assembly as well. So we've got elections to all of those. Crucial to all of those elections are the political parties. We often get very frustrated with political parties. They can feel very kind of irritating. But if you try to imagine how elections would work without political parties, how would we work out who we want to vote for, or who we need to hold to account for what's been going on if there weren't political parties? So the political parties are a really important part of the system. Also important, if we're going to be choosing who our representatives are or holding them to account, we need to have information about what they would do, what they have done, all that kind of thing. And we get quite a lot of the information from the media, and various other sources as well might be important in helping us to understand what's going on in the world of politics. And then also, so the representative system isn't just about us voting in our representatives and then kind of leaving them to it. It's also important that we can, if we want, express our views to our representatives, let them know what we think. And we can do that directly through writing to our MPs, speaking to our MPs, or we could take part in pressure groups, campaign organizations, trade unions, and business organizations. All of these are different kinds of pressure groups, and we can take part in demonstrations and so on as well. So lots of ways in which we can have our views heard among our representatives. So that's the representative system. And as I've said, that representative democracy is an essential part of our democracy. We couldn't have a democracy if we didn't have that representative process. But as I've also said, we often find it really frustrating, and we feel that our voice isn't sufficiently heard in that system, or that system just isn't working well enough. So one of the big questions for us to be thinking about this weekend is what's needed for the representative system to work well. But that's obviously a huge question. We could spend many weekends talking about that question, and we don't have that time. So we're going to focus particularly on two questions within that. So one is, what, if anything, do people need from the system in order for the system to work well, in order for us to be able to take part effectively in the system? So what do we need in terms of how the elections are working? What do we need in terms of the information that we can get about what's happening in democracy, and so on? So that's one question. And then another question, what, if anything, do people need to do themselves in order for this democracy to work well? So if none of us took part at all, we just wouldn't have a democracy. Democracy just wouldn't work in any way. So do we need to take part? Do we need, and just how much do we need to take part? Do we need to take part in particular ways? Do we need to speak in particular ways? Do we need to engage with each other, listen to each other in particular ways? There are lots of things about questions about what maybe we need to do in order for our democracy to work effectively as well. So that's one set of questions, but then there's also another set of questions. So there's actually kind of three ways in which we might think about how democracy should work. So one view of democracy is that we should be able to rely simply on that representative system that I've just set out, that system of elections and parties and so on. That should be enough, and actually that's the best way of making decisions, where everyone can have their say and things are properly thought through before the decisions are reached. But another view would say that, well, actually there should be ways in which people can make things happen between elections. So not just that people can express their views to their representatives, but actually if enough people say, this is what I think, this is my view, then there should be consequences to that. And referendums and petitions might be two ways in which people can have that kind of direct say on what happens. And then a third view would say that, well, actually, what's really vital in a democracy is that we are speaking with each other, listening to each other, working out what we think together, coming to kind of collective understandings on what should happen. That should be really at the heart of democracy. That it's not enough just that we're taking part in these big kind of elections and referendums, that we're taking part in the discussion about policy as well. And citizens' assemblies are one example of how that might be done, and there are other ways of doing it as well, which we'll be hearing about later this morning. So there are those three views of democracy. So getting back just to the questions for this weekend, we've got first that set of questions that I already laid out about the representative system and what needs to work for that representative system as a whole to work effectively. But then we also need a second set of questions about what role, if any, should be played by other bits of the system that perhaps are used less often, but might be, you might think are important: referendums, petitions, citizens' assemblies, and other similar processes. And also with those, we should be thinking what's needed for these mechanisms to work well. So just as what's needed for the representative system to work well, also if we're going to have referendums, petitions, citizens' assemblies, and so on, what's needed for those to work well as well. So that's it from me for now. I'll hand back to Kayla.
Okay, and before we really start sort of digging into some of those questions for the weekend, just want to get you back thinking about some of the things that you prioritized in the first couple of weekends that we met together, about the principles that really should underpin a good UK democracy. So you may remember in the first weekend, we started talking about these principles, and in the second weekend, we presented back sort of this idea of some emerging principles. We're going to spend some time this weekend both touching on it now, but also tomorrow morning really starting to think what these are really about. So you might recognize them, and I'm not going to go into detail of all of them in a minute. But what I've done just for our first conversation this morning is pick out 5 that you can see highlighted there that really seem to be at the heart of about how a good democracy relates to the role of the public and the public's ability to play an active role. So just to sort of remind you of these, particularly relevant to the role of the public, you identified this idea of free and inclusive elections, and emphasizing that, you know, that was vital to this idea of a good democracy, so that everyone can actually participate and have their vote count equally. You identified the need for systems of accountability and redress, so that, as we've just highlighted there, politicians who are seen as doing a poor job can be challenged and actually potentially removed. That another important role for the public was to actually be an informed and educated voter base, so that, you know, people are taking that responsibility and making choices on the basis of, you know, good, honest, and accessible information. That there was diversity in who the elected representatives were, so that, you know, people were able to feel that parliaments and governments are actually representative of the public as a whole. And whether that means actually, therefore, a greater range of people stepping up to be elected into those positions. And a final one there that was freedom of thought and speech, so that for the public to play an active role within a good representative system, there needed to be space within the sort of public domain for different views and that ability to question and or protest to drive change. So I'm just going to flag these to you as a starting point for today of some of the things that you collectively identified as being important for the role of the public in a good UK democracy. And on that point, we're going to open up the breakout rooms and just give you a little bit of time to get to meet with the people that you're going to be working with this weekend and start thinking about some of those emerging principles. So over to you, facilitators, and we'll see you in just over 15 minutes or so. So hopefully you've had a little bit of a chance then to get to meet the people you're going to be working with. And we're actually going to be in the same groups for the weekend, so we can keep building the conversations that we're having. So now we're ready to really get into the meat of what we're going to be talking about this weekend. And I'll hand over to Alan.
Thank you, Kayla. So I'm going to give you a quick introduction to the presentations that we're going to be having this morning. So just to remind you, first of all, of the questions that we're going to be exploring today. So that overall question about what's needed for the representative system to work well, the questions within that, and then questions about the roles that should be played maybe by other things like referendums and petitions and citizens' assemblies and the like. So we're going to have three presentations this morning exploring these different bits, three talks. The first presentation will be from Paula Surridge, and she's going to be talking about the representative system, particularly focusing in on elections. Then we'll have a second talk from Jess Sargent, who will be talking about those sorts of direct interventions, things like referendums and petitions. And then finally, we'll have a third talk from Jamie Pow, who will be talking about citizens' assemblies and other processes that are similar to citizens' assemblies in terms of getting people talking about about policy issues. So just before I introduce Paula's talk, it's worth just thinking, so they're mainly going to be talking about, well, what are these different systems, just how do they work in the UK? But they're also going to be offering us some initial thoughts that we'll explore further in the afternoon about what are the kind of pros and cons, what are the strengths and weaknesses of these different ways in which people can get involved in politics. So just a few things for you maybe to think out, listen out for when you're listening to the presentations, and to think about when you're considering this for yourself. So for each of these ways of taking part in politics, the first question you might ask is, well, how many people can take part? And are those people representative of the population as a whole? Then you might also ask, do the decisions that are reached through these different processes, do those decisions reflect what most people want? Or do those decisions take account of different interests and values that exist across society, the different rights that people have and so on, different views that people have across all the different parts of society? You might ask, are decisions thought through in ways we might hope them to be? And you might also ask, do decisions across different issues add up and make sense together? So we've kind of got a coherent set of policies that are being pursued across all the various different issues. So those are just a few points that you might consider. There are others that you might want to bring in as well, but those are just some initial suggestions from me. Okay, so the first talk is going to be from Paula Surridge, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Bristol and one of our leading experts examining public opinion towards politics in the UK. Now, Paula was really, really keen to take part this morning. Unfortunately, she can't actually be here today because one of her children has an away football match and she was needing to attend that. So Paula has recorded her presentation instead, and we're just going to play that in a moment. So she talks mostly about elections and taking part in elections, but you can see her title is How do the Public Participate in Politics More Broadly? So she starts off by exploring some of the other ways in which people can take part in politics as well. You'll see when you watch the video that she's got quite a lot of charts with quite a lot of numbers and things like that, so just be aware of that. Her slides are actually on the members website where you can get resources about the weekend. So if you do want to look at these numbers in a bit more detail, you'll be able to do that after the talk. And I'll also come back in just for a quick moment after her talk to say a few things, just to highlight some things that I thought were particularly interesting. So I'll stop sharing my screen and shut up now. And Juliet is going to share Paula's video.
Speak to you about how the public participate in politics. I'm going to focus in particular on why people vote in elections, but first I think it's important to get a sense of where elections fit in the overall landscape of political participation. This chart shows the proportion of the electorate who've taken part in different forms of political engagement. You can see that around 2/3 of people voted in the most recent general election, but for other forms of political engagement, participation is much, much lower. Relatively easy or low-cost forms of participation, such as voting in an online petition or boycotting a product, choosing not to buy a product, or buying a product for political reasons. These tend to be a little bit higher, but still done by a small proportion of the population. And direct engagement with political parties is something less than 1 in 20 people do. For the rest of the talk, I'm going to focus on voting in elections. And to give a little bit more context for this, this chart shows turnout rates for a range of different elections and referendums over the last 7 years. Both the Scottish independence referendum and the Brexit referendum had higher turnout than the most recent general election. But on the other side of the coin, local elections see quite low turnout, and almost 2/3 of people, in fact, don't bother to vote in local elections at all. Putting the most recent general election into a longer term context, we can see that there was a period in the 1990s and early 2000s where turnout seemed to be falling quite rapidly, but the most recent elections have seen a slight reversal of that trend. There are also important differences among different social groups that aren't shown directly on the chart. For example, more than 80% of those earning over £75,000 a year turn out to vote, compared with around half of those earning less than £15,000 a year. 54% of 18 to 24-year-olds turn out to vote, compared with 72% of 55 to 64-year-olds. Income, occupation and education have all seen widening gaps between the top social groups and the lower social groups, and increasingly in the social groups at the bottom of that order, there are often more non-voters than there are voters for any one particular party. Given that voting is so important in our democratic system, we might pose the question, why don't people vote? But I think it's more useful to perhaps turn that question around and ask, why do people vote? And I think that's especially helpful if we want to think about how we might motivate non-voters in the future. I've identified here 3 key motivations. The first is to vote as an expression of support for a party, out of a sense of loyalty, identification or connection with a party. People feel good about turning out to support the political party they feel connected to, in a similar way to turning up to support a sports team. Second, people feel it's their civic duty to vote, that they ought to vote because people have fought for their right to vote. And this can sometimes be felt particularly keenly among groups who, in relatively recent history, were not allowed to vote. Finally, some people vote to achieve a particular political outcome. For example, in 2019, some people voted to get Brexit done, even without a particular attachment to one political party. For this motivation to work, though, voters need to have not only clear objectives, what they want to achieve, but also to feel that their voices are heard and valued within the political system. We can look at survey data to see how important each of these different motivations are for turnout at general elections. So to think about party attachment, I've divided the electorate into 4 groups, ranging from a group with no party attachment through to a group who feel very strongly attached to a political party. You can see there's a clear ordering to the groups here. The more attached to a party a voter is, the darker is the yellow line here, then the more likely they are to turn out to vote. It's also really noticeable here that when we see low turnout elections, such as 2001, so elections which haven't enthused voters very much, those with strong party attachments are still likely to turn out to vote, while it's those without strong attachments or with only weak attachments who are more likely to stay at home. For context, around 50% of the electorate in 2019 either had no party identity or a not very strong party identity. In this next slide, I'm taking civic duty and political voice together and looking at some of the survey data around whether or not people express a sense of civic duty, and also the influence that that then has on turnout, particularly in general elections. So the pink column in this table shows the proportion of the electorate who agree or strongly agree with each of the statements that you can see there. So more than 7 in 10 voters feel it's every citizen's duty to vote. Just 13% of voters think that going to vote is a lot of effort. They seem like quite healthy figures for a democratic system. Perhaps more worrying is that 57% feel that people like me have no say in what government does, and just over half think it's often difficult to understand what's going on. The figures in the orangey coloured columns show the proportion of each group who agreed or disagreed with the statement who actually then turned out to vote. So only 26% of those who strongly agreed that going to vote is a lot of effort turned out to vote, while 88% of those who strongly agreed it was every citizen's duty to vote did so. So you can see here how both a sense of civic duty and a feeling that political voice is heard influence turnout, influence whether or not somebody turns out to vote at a general election. There's also a quite strong relationship here with feeling that things are too difficult to understand. So using these motivations as a starting point, how could we improve participation in elections? We might like to improve participation in general elections, but also other tiers of election where participation is much lower. First, there's a really important role for political parties to play in terms of motivating voters. But it's unlikely that fostering a sense of loyalty to party would be something that would work as a short-term fix. And it would also be going against the trends in the UK and elsewhere, which have seen voters become more volatile, that is, they change behaviour between elections much more often, and also much more disconnected from parties, much less likely to say that they strongly identify with a political party. Boosting a sense of civic duty, particularly among low engagement groups, might be a possible solution, but it's really difficult to do at the moment as opinions of politicians and politics are very, very low. Giving more reasons to people to think their voices are heard and effective, that's something that seems like it might work, but what would it mean in practice? What would we actually do to make people think their voices are being heard? And finally, helping voters to understand issues. This seems like a good thing to be doing regardless of its impact on turnout, but it also seems to influence turnout. If people understand issues, they seem to be more willing to turn out and vote. But there's important questions there about who should actually take the lead on any such programme, who really should be responsible for voter education. So while turnout in general elections doesn't seem to be in terminal decline in the UK, there still remain important questions about who votes and what it means for the representation of groups who choose not to.
So that was Paula's presentation. So lots of really interesting information there about levels of participation and also who takes part in different forms of politics. I just wanted to go back to one of Paula's slides there, which I found really interesting and contained a lot of information and went by quite quickly. Maybe it wasn't time to take it all in. So this was her first slide where she talked about how many people take part in all sorts of different ways of taking part in the representative process. So just to remind you, she pointed out at the bottom there, voting in the last general election in the UK. So about 2/3 of people took part in voting in the general election. But then if you look immediately above that, you can see the proportion of people who took part in any kind of way in a political party or a pressure group, an action group, or anything like that. And you can see it's kind of 2%, 4%, 7% taking part in various different kinds of ways. So just kind of less than 1 person in 10, about 1 person in 20 taking part in these ways of participating in politics. So really, really small numbers of it, actually. And these are ways of taking part in politics that have a big impact. So you can see that most of us, though, aren't doing that. And then if you go up another step, people contacting a politician or a government official, so writing to their MP, for example, 12% of people did that. So that's 1 person in 8 contacted any kind of politician or government official. So again, that's quite an important way in which we might be able to influence what happens and shape what our representatives do. But the great majority of us aren't doing it. So that raises lots of questions that Paula was raising at the end there about, well, just why is it that people aren't taking part? So it might be that we just don't feel that we're going to be heard. No one's going to actually listen to us if we take part. It might be that we don't feel we've got enough information about how we can contact people and what are the best ways of having influence. It might be that we just kind of feel, well, someone else can do it. I've got other things to do in my life. So lots of questions and possibilities about why we take part, why we don't take part in politics. And so lots of stuff to chew on there. So I shall finish there and hand back to Kayla, who I think is going to send you into some groups to think about this further.
I am. We're going to go back into the breakout rooms for just about 20 minutes, really, to sort of, I suppose, start thinking about, well, what works well in the current sort of representative system that enables people to actually sort of use their vote and use their voice to actually be involved in decision making, but also what maybe doesn't work so well at the minute or as well as it could. So over to you. So hopefully you've got somewhere to take notes, lots of interesting things coming up for you now. I'll hand over to Alan to introduce the presentations.
Thank you, Kayla. Yes, lots more interesting stuff. So the next talk is on referendums and petitions. So there's kind of direct mechanisms for causing things to happen between elections. And our speaker for this is Jess Sargent. Jess works at the Institute for Government, which is an independent body that does research on government and democracy in the UK. Jess also used to work with us at the UCL Constitution Unit for our work on referendums. So she's a real expert on these matters. And Jess, over to you.
Thanks, Alan. Great. So my name is Jess and I'm going to talk about direct democracy. So this is when citizens have the opportunity to directly shape the decisions that affect them. And I'm going to talk about two mechanisms for direct democracy, as Alan mentioned there, referendums and petitions. So firstly, referendums. Referendums are where the public can vote directly on a particular issue or question. So different to elections where they elect a specific representative. The UK has held relatively few referendums. There have only been 13 of these large-scale votes. Some of these have been held in one part of the UK, so like the Scottish independence referendum, and there have only been 3 UK-wide referendums. But actually a lot of other countries like Italy or Switzerland hold multiple referendums a year. Referendums can be held on a range of topics. The first is who the people are. As some speakers have said in earlier weekends, democracy ultimately is about power of the people, and a referendum is often used to work out who the people are. In the UK, as I mentioned before, we've had the referendum on Scottish independence, and independence referendums have been held in other countries, so for example in Quebec in Canada and Catalonia in Spain. The second topic on which we usually hold referendums is on changing the constitution, so that's the rules on who has the power to do what. Referendums might be particularly appropriate on issues about where power should lie. So it isn't just the people who already have the power under the current rules who decide that. In the UK, most referendums have been on constitutional issues. So we had referendums before the establishment of the Scottish and Welsh Assemblies, and we also held a referendum on the voting system. But not all constitutional issues have been put to a referendum. So we've had major reforms like House of Lords reform that didn't require a vote of the people. Referendums are also very common in other countries on constitutional issues, and in some cases, a vote of the public is required to approve any change to the constitution. Some other countries like Ireland and Italy have also held referendums on moral questions. So things like abortion or divorce and gay marriage have often required approval in a referendum. But we don't tend to hold referendums of this type in the UK. Referendums can also be held on regular policy questions. So, for example, there's been a referendum in the Netherlands on whether to approve a law that would give the intelligence services new powers. And in Italy, there has been a referendum on oil drilling. The UK doesn't tend to hold referendums of this type on these kind of regular policy questions, but it could, in theory, if Parliament decided to do so. So who can call a referendum? In the UK, referendums can only be held if a majority of politicians in Parliament vote to hold one. This means that they usually have the support of the government as well. And this is quite common in other countries. But referendums in other countries sometimes also happen automatically. So if politicians are trying to do something like change the constitution that requires the approval of the people under the rules, then that will automatically trigger a referendum. In some countries, there's the ability for a minority of politicians, so let's say a third or a quarter of those in the legislature or the parliament, to call a referendum on an issue. And some countries also have provisions for citizens to call referendums. So in places like Italy and Switzerland and New Zealand, citizens can call a referendum if a certain number of people sign a petition calling for one. Sometimes this is on a specific law. In other cases, there can be referendums on anything. Usually if people vote for something in a referendum, politicians are expected to implement that result. That's usually quite straightforward if that's been set out in detail or sometimes in law, but it can get quite messy if the details of what a vote for change actually haven't been worked out yet. As Paula mentioned earlier, in some referendums, turnout has been very high and even higher than in elections. So for example, there was 85% turnout in the Scottish independence referendum. But in other votes, it's also been quite low. So there was only 34% of people turned out to vote in the 1998 referendum on whether to create the position of the London mayor. So it's usually best that referendums are held on issues that people are really interested in. So there's a couple of things we might want to think about the use of referendums, whether we should hold more or fewer referendums. Should decisions be referred to the people more often? And if we do that, how do we ensure those are issues that people are very interested in so turnout is high? Should we hold referendums on a wider range of issues? As I said, the UK doesn't tend to hold referendums on things like moral questions or regular policy questions, so you might want to think about whether it should. Who should have the power to call a referendum? As I mentioned, there's provisions for things like citizens-initiated referendums in other countries. But this could mean holding a lot of votes on an issues that a small number of people feel really strongly about, but most people aren't that interested in. And we might also want to think about how we can ensure that people get the information that they need to make informed decisions. Unlike elections that happen every 5 years, people might not have thought much about a question they're being asked in a referendum before it's called. It's usually referendum campaigners, those advocating for one side or the other, that are the main source of information. But we can't be sure that they'll always give high quality information because they want to make their case. So we might want to think about what other sources of information we could make available to voters. The second mechanism for direct democracy in the UK is petitions. So a petition is a mechanism that allows a citizen to express a view on an issue. And there are lots of different types of petitions, like those set up by charities or websites like change.org that you might be familiar with. But there are only two types of official petitions that allow the public to require certain things to happen. The first one of these is recall. Recall is a mechanism that allows voters to trigger an election if their MP has been given a prison sentence or found to have seriously broken parliamentary rules. If that happens, then a petition is opened that voters in that particular constituency can sign. If 10% of people registered to vote in that area sign the petition, then an election is held. If they don't reach that threshold, then the MP remains in post. So far, there have been 3 recall petitions in the UK since it was introduced. 2 of those have been successful. The second type of petition is a petition for Parliament to consider a particular issue. So any British citizen or UK resident can sign a petition about an issue that the UK government or the UK Parliament is responsible for. And Scottish Parliament has its own different system for doing this. If a petition gets 10,000 signatures, then it must get a response from the government in which they might explain their position on that issue, what they're doing in that area, and why they do or don't agree with the petition. At 100,000 signatures, the petition is considered for debate in Parliament. And so far, there have been 101 petitions that have been debated in Parliament. This debate is usually just a discussion of the issue. There's no vote and no decision is made, but they can influence decision makers in other ways. A couple of things we might want to think about on the use of petitions. is whether they should be used to call for other things. I'll just mention two ideas for now. One is referendums. As I said before, petitions can be used to trigger referendums in some countries, or perhaps a petition could be used to trigger something like a citizens' assembly. That is all for me from now. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Jess. We're going to go back into the breakout rooms now for about 20, 25 minutes just to explore some of these ideas. And I know some of these conversations in the mornings feel like they're quite short, but trust me, we're going to be building up our understanding of these topics when we come back in the afternoon. We've got some good time set aside later this afternoon to sort of dig into them a bit deeper. And then tomorrow, no new information, no presentations, just that time for you to work together to really kind of do something with this and draw some conclusions. So we'll open up the breakout rooms now. We've got everyone back. Fantastic. Okay, so as we said, we were going to have the 3 presentations this morning, and we're now going to move on to our 3rd presentation, who again is talking about different ways that people in the public may be able to influence decisions that are made by governments and by parliaments. So I'll hand over to Alan.
Thank you, Keller. So yes, particularly this time we're talking about citizens' assemblies and other processes like that for getting involved. So the general terms that we use to describe the things that citizens' assemblies are an example of are deliberative democracy and participatory democracy, rather long words, but those are the words that we sometimes use. And here to talk about those is Jamie Powell, and Jamie is a lecturer.
As far as I can see, Alan appears to be mute.
Oh.
I can hear
other people
fine.
hear me?
I can hear you. I'm not sure what's happened there.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I can
I'm
hear you.
perfectly all right.
I can hear you, yeah.
Oh, I can hear you.
Hopefully,
Okay,
hopefully when we then hand over to Jamie, you'll be able to hear Jamie.
Cancel that. The fault seems to be at my end.
Okay, hopefully we
Thank
can
you,
get
Dan.
it sorted.
Surprise, surprise.
These things happen. So Jamie is lecturer at Queen's University Belfast and an expert on citizens' assemblies and all things to do with deliberative democracy. So Jamie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alan. So could you just confirm, Alan, that you can see my screen okay?
We certainly can.
That's excellent. Okay, well, good morning, everyone. You're all familiar now with what a citizens' assembly is. It's an opportunity for people to come together, talk through an issue, make recommendations on it. And citizens' assemblies are one example of this kind of approach to politics. There are others as well, and we sometimes refer to these processes, as Alan says, with the terms of deliberative and participatory democracy. So the basic idea of all of these approaches is that democracy should be about much more than voting in elections every 4 or 5 years. How all kinds of political decisions are taken matters a great deal. And according to this view, the public should be more active. They should play a more active role in the process of decision making, beyond simply deciding who to vote for or whether to vote yes or no in a referendum. And the idea of deliberative democracy, as well as participatory democracy, also emphasizes thinking about relevant information, arguments, and perspectives before policy decisions are taken. So on this view, members of the public should be openly discussing and weighing up the issues with one another before deciding on the best way forward. Now, that might sound quite idealistic, but citizens' assemblies and other deliberative processes have been getting much more common around the world in recent decades. So I want to just emphasize 3 features of citizens' assemblies and similar processes. Firstly, the participants of citizens' assemblies are randomly selected from the whole population. There are usually about 100 members in total, sometimes fewer, sometimes more. And this helps to ensure that the members are like the wider population in terms of age, gender, social class, political attitudes, and so on. The second important feature of citizens' assemblies is that the members have the chance to deliberate. They learn about the issue in question, they hear different arguments and viewpoints, and they discuss these with one another. But they don't just deliberate for the sake of it, although that is important in itself. But this brings me to the third and final important feature of citizens' assemblies, which is that members reach some sort of collective decision or decisions about the issue they were asked to consider. And these decisions are almost always advisory in nature rather than binding. So those are some key features of citizens' assemblies in general. Let's now consider some examples of citizens' assemblies in practice. In parts of Canada, they have been held to consider whether or not to change the voting system. In Ireland, citizens' assemblies have looked at issues including abortion, same-sex marriage, and climate change. And in one part of Belgium, there are regular citizens' assemblies on topics which are identified by other citizens, and their recommendations are then debated in the regional parliament. In the UK, committees of the UK Parliament have commissioned 2 citizens' assemblies to date. The first looked at how social care in England should be funded. The second was called the Climate Assembly, and it considered how the UK should meet its net zero carbon emissions targets by 2050. In Scotland, the Scottish Government held a citizens' assembly on a range of broad topics about Scotland's future, and another assembly was held on climate change. And in Wales, the Welsh Assembly, as it was then known before it was officially renamed the Senedd, it held a citizens' assembly on how people in Wales can help shape their future. Other citizens' assemblies have been held across the UK at the local level, often on the topic of climate change. Thinking overall about impact, there are mixed results from these processes around the world. Many citizens' assembly recommendations have been taken up and implemented. For example, the Irish government put the citizens' assembly recommendation to open up abortion laws to a referendum in which voters backed the change. Other recommendations, such as a proposal to introduce a new tax on agricultural greenhouse gas emissions in Ireland, they have not been implemented. So mixed impact overall. From these examples, one key thing to take away is that citizens' assemblies can be set up in different ways, and they have been used to consider a wide range of issues. For example, they can be one-off events, or they can be held on a more regular basis. They may be called by governments or parliamentary committees. And it's also possible to imagine that citizens' assemblies could be called by members of the public through a petition, as Jess mentioned in her presentation. Their decisions are almost always recommendations rather than binding decisions. And those recommendations can go to Parliament and government for a final decision, or the issue can be put to a referendum. And in theory, a government could make an advance commitment to implement any citizens' assembly recommendations, whatever they may be, but that would be quite rare. Now, citizens' assemblies aren't the only type of process that can give members of the public a role in helping to make political decisions. I'll just mention one other example this morning, and it's called participatory budgeting. As the name suggests, it involves the public deciding how a certain allocation of public money should be spent. These processes tend to be held at the local level. Unlike with randomly selected citizens' assemblies, anyone living in the area is usually eligible to take part and can attend. So many more people could be involved, but those who choose to turn up aren't necessarily representative of the whole local population. Also, unlike citizens' assemblies, there may be less of a commitment to careful deliberation ahead of making decisions. This type of process, participatory budgeting, was first used in a Brazilian city called Porto Alegre, where in 1999, over 20% of the city's total spending was allocated through participatory budgeting. And these processes have also been used in the UK in recent years, usually to help to decide how relatively small community grants should be spent. In Scotland, local authorities and the Scottish Government are aiming for at least 1% of local government spending to be decided through participatory budgeting by the end of this year. And finally, having briefly outlined some deliberative and participatory processes and what they involve, I want to leave you now with some initial thoughts about how these processes may be evaluated. So in terms of participation, they provide the public with the opportunity to be directly involved in decision-making, or at least making recommendations. But the total number of people taking part directly is necessarily small in the case of citizens' assemblies. And even with participatory budgeting, only a small proportion of the public eligible tends to take part. In terms of representing what the public wants, citizens' assemblies start with a group that is broadly representative of the wider public due to the way that they are selected. But after members learn about and deliberate on the issue in question, their views may become quite different to the views of the wider public. But in this regard, the recommendations of citizens' assemblies at least reflect informed and considered views. If we didn't think that information and deliberation were important, then a standard opinion poll could always give us a snapshot on public opinion on any issue. And finally, if we think about the overall impact of these processes, some do result in recommendations being adopted, either directly by the government or after a referendum, but this isn't always the case, which highlights the potential for a tension to emerge when trying to connect citizens' assemblies, and indeed other deliberative or participatory processes, with existing processes and institutions. So in this short talk, I've given you some background to deliberative and participatory processes. I hope it'll give you plenty to think about and discuss in your groups. And I'll of course be happy to answer any questions that you might have. And I can go into more detail in some of these closing thoughts in the afternoon session as well. So for now, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jamie. So again, another take on how the public and people in general can be more involved in influencing the decisions that are made by governments and by parliaments. So we're going to put you back into your breakout groups. We're going to send you straight to lunch at the end of your breakout group discussion. So I won't see you again back here in the main room, but I will see you after lunch when we restart at 2 o'clock. So until then, enjoy your conversations.